My name is Sarah, and to say I was a reluctant inheritor would be an understatement. A few months ago, my Aunt Megan, my mother's sister, passed away, leaving her entire estate to me. And by estate, I mean a dilapidated farmhouse, a few acres of overgrown land, and a lifetime's collection of junk. Megan was a severe hoarder and, at the same time, intensely devout. The house was crammed with religious paraphernalia, crosses, icons, stacks of Bibles, and handwritten prayers taped to every spare inch of wall. I'm not religious myself, so the house felt oppressive, suffocatingly heavy. But family is family. I felt a duty to sort through her things, to decide what to keep, what to donate, and what to burn. The farm was deep in rural Alabama, miles from the nearest town and surrounded by dense forest. The most prominent feature was the massive, ancient oak tree in the front yard. It stood like some kind of malevolent presence, silently watching over the property. The tree gave me the creeps. It felt like it was watching me. I planned to stay for a week to sort through everything by myself. My husband, Tom, couldn't get away from work, so I came alone. I naively thought it would be a lonely but peaceful time. I was wrong. So wrong. The nightmare began with a Bible. I'd spent most of the day clearing out the living room, which was a treacherous landscape of boxes, old newspapers, and religious pamphlets. The air was thick with dust and mildew, the silence broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards and the monotonous drone of a housefly. Toward evening, I decided to tackle the area around the fireplace, a massive stone structure that dominated one wall. Tucked behind a pile of dusty hymnals, I found a small, leather-bound Bible. The cover was cracked and worn, its gold lettering nearly faded to nothing, and several pages had come loose inside. Curiosity got the better of me, and I opened it. The pages were brittle and yellowed, and many passages had been underlined in faded red ink. It was clearly a book that had been used often, a vessel for some private, hidden faith. But what truly chilled me was the set of rules written in a faint, spidery script on the inside of the back cover. Rule 1. Do not read from this Bible after sunset. Rule 2. When not in use, it must be kept closed and secured. Rule 3. Do not tear or remove any pages. And yet, this one was already missing some. Rule 4. If you hear whispers, do not answer. Rule 5. If the room grows cold, pray silently until it warms. Rule 6. Never leave this Bible under the oak tree at night. I frowned. This was a bit much, even for Megan. I knew she was fanatical, but this bordered on paranoid, like rules for some kind of cult. I shook my head, chalking it up to another one of her eccentricities. I set the Bible on the mantelpiece, figuring I'd keep it as a memento. Dinner was simple: canned soup and saltine crackers. The house, though wired for electricity, held a persistent chill, as if the warm, humid Alabama air couldn't penetrate its walls. After eating, I decided to take a walk to clear my head. Up close, the oak tree was even more intimidating. Its trunk was as wide as a wall, its branches gnarled and twisted like skeletal arms reaching for the twilight sky, either in prayer or threat. I noticed a scorched patch of earth at its base, as if something had been burned there. It was old, but the char mark was still distinct. I suddenly remembered the rule: never leave this Bible under the oak tree at night. I backed away from the tree, trying to shake off the unease. I walked the perimeter of the farm, past the fallow fields and the encroaching tree line, as the sun sank lower, casting long shadows that threatened to swallow the world. On my way back to the house, I heard it. A faint murmur, like someone whispering right beside your ear, but you can't quite make out the words. It came from everywhere at once, as if the air itself was muttering. Rule 4 slammed into my mind: if you hear whispers, do not answer. Do not answer. I told myself it was just the wind in the leaves, but I knew it wasn't. It was someone talking. I practically ran back to the house, slammed the door, and threw the deadbolt, slumping against it with my heart pounding in my chest. The peace of a night had just been shattered. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was just the wind, just my imagination. But I knew it wasn't a hallucination. Something was wrong here. Very, very wrong. My eyes drifted to the Bible on the mantelpiece. It was open. I distinctly remembered closing it and setting it down. But there it was, lying open, as if it had been thumbed through by an unseen hand. A cold dread snaked its way up my spine. Did I remember wrong? Was I already losing my mind after just one day in this creepy house? I slowly approached the fireplace, my eyes glued to the book. The closer I got, the more I could hear that familiar whispering sound. It was back. Only this time, it wasn't outside, not under the oak tree. It was coming from the Bible itself. The sound was soft, indistinct, like a dream, but it carried a chilling clarity. My hand trembling, I reached out and slammed the book shut. The whispering stopped. Instantly, the silence that followed was immense, like a tide receding, leaving behind a heavy, empty atmosphere. The only sound was my own heart, threatening to beat its way out of my chest. I stood there, staring at the closed Bible, trying to will myself to calm down. It's just an old book, I told myself over and over. A collection of old stories. Nothing to be afraid of. But the feeling of unease wouldn't leave. I felt like I had done something wrong. By opening that book, I had triggered something that should have been left sleeping. I thought back to the rules on the back cover. Rule 2. When not in use, it must be kept closed and secured. I had closed it, but I hadn't secured it. Did that count as a violation? I rummaged through nearby drawers and finally found some rough twine in an old wooden desk, the kind used for bundling vegetables. As if performing some ancient ritual, I carefully wrapped the twine around the book and tied it tight. The action made me feel like an idiot, but after it was done, I did feel a little better. I spent the rest of the night on high alert. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves against the house sent my pulse racing. I turned on every single light, deciding I'd rather face a massive electric bill than sit in the dark. I tried to distract myself with a novel I brought, but with every page I turned, my mind kept drifting back to the whispers, the scorched earth under the oak, and those 6 bizarre rules. Around 10, I decided to go to bed. I was exhausted, physically and mentally, and hoped that even a few hours of sleep would be better than being tormented by my thoughts. The bedroom was small and Spartan, containing only a single bed, a creaky dresser, and a small window that looked out onto the backyard. Outside was nothing but inky blackness and the occasional chirp of some unknown insect. I quickly changed, brushed my teeth, and crawled under the covers. I lay there in the dark, listening to the wind moan through the cracks in the window frame and the repetitive, sharp scrape of the oak tree's branches against the side of the house, like something lightly scratching at my nerves. And then I felt it. The temperature dropped. Suddenly, the air in the room changed, becoming bitingly, bone-deeply cold. Goosebumps erupted all over my skin. I immediately remembered the 5th rule. If the room grows cold, pray silently until it warms. I squeezed my eyes shut and began to pray. I'm not a religious person, but I still remembered the Lord's Prayer from childhood. I clung to it like a lifeline, reciting it over and over in my head. But the cold didn't leave. It got worse, as if I were lying in an ice house. My teeth began to chatter, and I couldn't stop shivering. I pulled the covers tighter around me, trying to fight off the chill seeping into my bones from the very air itself. Then I heard the sound again. The whispers. Faint, but undeniably real. This time they weren't muffled. They were coming from the corner of the room, right by the dresser. I kept my eyes shut, praying frantically, my silent pleas turning into a scream inside my head. The whispering grew clearer, sounding like some ancient, broken chant. I couldn't understand it, but I recognized one thing. It was Latin. I felt it arrive. A presence entered the room. It wasn't a cold spot in the air anymore. It felt like a heavy, physical thing hovering, looking down at me. I could feel it watching me. There was no sound, but the feeling of its gaze was a physical weight on my chest. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I felt like a sacrifice on an altar, able to do nothing but lie there and await my fate. And then it stopped. The cold receded as if it had been sucked out of the room. The whispering ceased. I gasped for air, drenched in sweat, as if I'd just been pulled from ice water. I opened my eyes. The room was empty, with only the faint sound of the wind outside. I looked at my watch. It was exactly midnight. I lay there, rigid, for 2 more hours. It felt like an eternity. I knew I wouldn't be sleeping again. Every shadow seemed to hide something. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like an approaching footstep. I stared at the ceiling, my mind a chaotic mess, the Latin, the whispers, the Bible, Megan. When the first hint of dawn appeared, I finally got up, exhausted but hyper-aware. I needed coffee, strong coffee. Walking into the kitchen, the floorboards groaned under my feet. The weak daylight made the house feel less oppressive, but the memory of last night was a clinging ghost. As the coffee pot started to gurgle, my eyes fell on something on the kitchen table. It was the Bible. My heart skipped a beat. I knew I had left it on the mantelpiece, tied securely with twine. But there it was, lying open, brazenly displayed on the tabletop. I approached it slowly, as if it were an unexploded bomb. The twine was gone. The little, battered book lay open, as if waiting for me. With a trembling hand, I reached out and my fingertip brushed the thin, brittle paper. It felt like touching the skin of something alive. I looked down and saw that it was open to a passage in the book of Revelation. The verses were underlined in that same faded red ink from the rules on the back cover. I felt a strange, powerful, and almost irresistible urge to read the passage out loud. I knew I shouldn't. Rule 1 was clear about not reading it after sunset. But it was morning now. The sun was up. It should be fine, right? My voice shaking, I began to read the words, the sound echoing in the silent kitchen. I watched as the Lamb opened the first of the 7 seals. Then I heard one of the 4 living creatures say in a voice like thunder, "Come." I looked, and there before me was a white horse. Its rider held a bow, and he was given a crown, and he rode out as a conqueror bent on conquest. A figure flashing past the window shattered the moment, sending a fresh wave of terror through me. I scrambled backward, my heart hammering against my ribs. I had to get out of the kitchen, out of this house, out of here. I stumbled toward the living room, my legs weak and unsteady. A quick glance confirmed my fear. The Bible was gone from the mantelpiece, because of course it was on the kitchen table. My mind raced, questioning my own sanity. Just as I reached the front door, I heard a slow, heavy creak from behind me, the sound of someone deliberately walking across the old floorboards. I froze, my hand clamped on the doorknob, and slowly turned, my heart in my throat. Standing in the kitchen doorway was a tall, gaunt figure, cloaked in shadow. It was the same one I'd glimpsed in the woods, the same one that had flashed past the window, but now was inside my house. Its face was a blur of darkness, but I could feel its cold, malevolent gaze, as if the shadows themselves had taken human form. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My throat felt tight, my vocal cords paralyzed. The figure slowly raised a hand, its long, skeletal fingers pointing right at me. Then I heard the voice again, a low, rasping whisper that echoed through the room. "You have awakened him." The voice didn't come from the figure, it was everywhere at once. It was the same voice from moments ago, the one that had whispered in Latin as I read from the Bible. "You have broken the seal." The figure began to move toward me, its steps slow but unervingly steady. I could feel its cold breath, an oppressive presence that smothered me. I fumbled with the doorknob, my fingers stiff and uncooperative, until it finally turned. I yanked the door open and stumbled out onto the porch, into the blinding morning light. The sudden shift from the dark house to the bright sun made me dizzy. I glanced back, half expecting to see the thing still standing in the doorway, but it was empty. There was only a dead, heavy silence. I didn't stop to think. I just ran, scrambling toward the woods. I knew it was probably the most dangerous place to go, but I couldn't think straight. All I wanted was to get away. The voice was back, whispering right next to my ear, a taunting hiss. "You cannot escape. He is coming." I tripped on a root and went down hard, just like the night before, only this time there was no flashlight. I lay there, gasping for breath, bruised and aching, staring up at the blue sky and the white, fluffy clouds. It was such a beautiful, peaceful day, and yet I was trapped in this nightmare. I forced myself to my feet. My legs were trembling, but I had to keep moving. I had to find a place to hide, a place to think. I remembered an old, abandoned barn not far from the house, down a narrow, overgrown path. It was a wreck and probably wasn't safe, but it was the only other structure on the property. Slowly, carefully, I made my way toward it, constantly looking back, terrified the figure would be right behind me. But all I saw were the trees, the fields, and the silent, indifferent house. The path to the barn was choked with weeds and thorns that tore my arms and legs, but I pushed through, ignoring the stinging cuts. The barn was a sad, collapsing thing. Its wooden walls were warped and weathered, and the roof had caved in several places, leaving gaping, dark holes. I hesitated at the entrance, peering inside. It was dim and dusty, the air thick with the smell of decay and old manure. I could hear the faint scuttling of unseen creatures and the occasional coo of pigeons in the rafters. It wasn't inviting, but it was better than being out in the open, at the mercy of whatever was hunting me. I stepped inside, my eyes slowly adjusting to the gloom. The barn was cluttered with rusty farm equipment, rotting hay bales, and cobwebs that hung from the beams like funeral shrouds. Motes of dust danced in the sunbeams, slicing through the holes in the walls. I found a relatively clear corner and hid behind an overturned, ancient truck. I sank to the dirt floor, my back against the rough wood, and tried to catch my breath. I was exhausted, my body and mind screaming. My head throbbed. I needed a plan, but the fear was still too raw, too overwhelming. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the images, the sounds, the whispers, but it was no use. They were burned into me now, a part of me. Then I remembered something, a fragment of a story Megan had once told, something about the Bible. It had belonged to a pastor who was hanged from that old oak tree in the front yard. The tree with the scorched roots that had drawn my attention. A new wave of fear, colder and deeper than anything I'd felt before, washed over me. This wasn't just some random ghost or demon. This was something specific, something tied to Megan, to this farm, and to that Bible. I opened my eyes and scanned the barn, searching for something, a clue, a sign, anything that could help me understand the horror I was facing. My gaze landed on a small wooden box in the corner, half hidden by a pile of burlap sacks. The box looked ancient, its wood cracked and weathered, its iron hinges rusted solid. I felt a strange pull, the same feeling I'd had when I looked at the oak tree, as if this box held a key, a piece of the puzzle. I crawled over, my heart racing, and pried at the lid. It opened with a groan. Inside was a collection of old letters, yellowed photographs, and newspaper clippings. I carefully lifted them out, my fingers trembling. Most of the letters were addressed to Megan from various family members. The photos showed her at different ages, sometimes with people I didn't recognize. But it was the fragile, yellowed newspaper clippings that grabbed my attention. The print was faded, but I could still make out the headlines. Local pastor lynched by mob. Accused of heresy and witchcraft. My blood ran cold. I scanned the article, my eyes flying across the words. It described how a pastor named Elijah Croft had been accused of using dark magic and corrupting the community. He was hanged from the oak tree in front of his own house, and his body was burned afterward. This house, this farm, the lynching had happened right here. And that little Bible, it must have been his. I looked through the other clippings. They detailed the aftermath of the lynching, the trial of the mob members, the controversy surrounding the event. Then I found a tiny article almost hidden at the bottom of the page. It described a strange set of rules found written on the back cover of the pastor's Bible, intended to seal his spirit. The same rules I'd seen, the same rules I had broken. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I had awakened a vengeful spirit, a murdered, wrong pastor. And he was back. He was the whispers, the cold, the figure in the shadows. He was using Megan's Bible as a conduit. But why me? What did he want? The clippings held the horrifying answer. Breaking the rules would allow his spirit to possess Megan, to carry out his revenge. This spirit wasn't just back for revenge, it had a target and had used Megan's body. The missing pages, the newly added rule about not leaving the Bible under the tree, it all made sense now. Megan must have found and broken some of the rules, which explained the scorched mark at the base of the tree. She had tried to destroy the Bible by burning it, but failed only managing to anger the spirit. And I had repeated her mistake, strengthening the pastor's power and making myself his new target. Possession, that's what was happening. I was going to be the vessel for his vengeance. I looked down at the newspapers again, desperately searching for any clue about Elijah Croft's plan. A recurring theme emerged: fire. He had been accused of using fire in dark rituals. The mob had burned his body. Megan had tried to burn the Bible. Fire. Was that the key? He wanted to burn everything: the farm, the community, everyone who had ever wronged him. Suddenly, I heard a crackling sound from outside the barn. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, clearer. I already knew what it was. I crawled to the barn door and peered out. The house was engulfed in flames. Fire shot from the windows and licked at the roof, consuming the wooden structure with a hungry rage. A thick plume of black smoke billowed into the sky, blotting out the sun. The revenge had begun. I stared in horror, my mind blank, my body frozen. I should have been running for my life, but I couldn't move, mesmerized by the destructive inferno. And then I saw him. He was standing in front of the burning house, a silhouette against the blaze. The tall, gaunt form, his face still lost in shadow, but there was no mistaking him. It was Elijah Croft, or at least his spirit. He stared at the fire, his arms raised to the sky, as if in prayer or celebration. The voice came again, the same rasping whisper, but stronger now, clearer, and filled with a cold, triumphant satisfaction. Vengeance. The word wasn't just in my head anymore. It was in the air, carried on the wind, piercing through the roar of the flames. The figure slowly turned its head and looked directly at me. I couldn't see its eyes, but I felt its cold, malevolent gaze cut right through me. I understood with a bone-deep certainty. I was next. The fire was just the beginning. His revenge needed to burn through me to be complete. I scrambled back into the barn, away from the burning house, away from the figure, away from the terrifying reality I had unleashed. Panic seized my throat, a desperate need to flee, threatening to tear me apart. But where could I go? He was everywhere. The burning house was a beacon of his power. The woods offered no shelter, only the memory of his lurking presence. I scrambled back to the wooden box, my mind racing. The letters and photos were useless. The key was the Bible, Croft's Bible. I had to destroy it, truly destroy it, not fail like Megan had. But how? Fire was his element, his weapon. Burning it would be useless, maybe even strengthen him. Water? I had no way to get enough to destroy a book completely. Bury it? He was already buried under that cursed oak. The ground wouldn't hold him. Then I remembered bits of folklore I'd read in my frantic search, ways to deal with vengeful spirits. Salt, iron, holy relics. Iron. The barn was filled with old farm tools, rusty equipment. There had to be something I could use. I shot to my feet, my eyes scanning the dark corners of the barn. There, near the back wall, was a heap of rusted iron. I rushed over, heart pounding, and began digging through it. Horseshoes, a broken plowshare, twisted bits of wire, and then I found it. A heavy iron stake, the kind used to tether livestock. It was long and pointed. Despite the rust, the tip was still sharp. It was perfect. I grabbed the stake. Its heavy weight was a strange comfort in my hand. I knew what I had to do. It was a long shot, but it was my only shot. I had to drive the stake through the Bible, pin it, seal its power. I went back to where I'd been sitting, desperately looking for the Bible. I remember dropping in my panic. It had to be nearby, but it was gone. Panic, hotter and more intense than before, flared inside me. Where was the Bible? Had he taken it? Was I too late? Then I saw it, not on the ground, but resting on the overturned truck, as if it had been placed there for me. It was open to the passage from Revelation I had read aloud, the very words that had awakened him. I knew it was a trap. He wanted me to get close, to touch it again. But I had no choice. I moved toward the truck slowly, cautiously, the iron stake gripped tight in my hand. The air around the Bible seemed to shimmer with an unseen energy. The cold was more intense here than it had ever been. I reached out a trembling hand and grabbed the Bible. The moment my fingers touched the leather cover, a jolt like an electric current shot up my arm and through my entire body. I gasped as my vision blurred. The whispers returned, a chaotic storm of them now. Dozens of voices speaking over each other in Latin, in English, in languages I couldn't comprehend. I saw the figure again, not through a window this time, but inside my own head, clearer, more solid. His face, or what was left of it, was a skull with empty sockets and a lipless mouth stretched open in a silent scream of rage and hate. He reached out a skeletal hand, and I felt phantom fingers close around my throat. I raised the iron stake, my arm shaking, and with every ounce of strength I had left, I drove it down. The stake pierced through the Bible, pinning it to the wooden bed of the truck. A deafening shriek, both human in its pain and inhuman in its fury, exploded through the barn. The air crackled with energy. The barn itself seemed to shake. The storm of whispers rose to a fever pitch, and then, abruptly, fell silent. The cold vanished. The figure in my mind dissolved. Outside, I could still hear the faint crackle of the burning house, but the sound was distant now, no longer a threat. I stood there, panting, my hands still clutching the iron stake that held the Bible pinned to the wood. I didn't know if it had worked, if I was truly safe, but for the first time since that first night, I felt a flicker of hope, fragile and weak, but there. I stayed in the barn until the fire burned itself out, leaving the farmhouse a smoking ruin. I didn't dare go near it. I didn't dare pull the iron stake from the Bible. I just waited, watching it, listening, praying that it was really over. As the sun began to set, I finally left the barn, left the farm, left the cursed oak tree and the ashes of what was once my aunt's home. I didn't look back. I walked for miles until I reached the nearest town. I called Tom, my voice trembling as I told him a simplified story about a fire, an old Bible, a strange feeling I'd had. I didn't tell him about the whispers, the figure, or the pastor's spirit. I knew he wouldn't believe me. He would just think I'd gone insane. He came and picked me up, his face a mask of worry and confusion, and he took me home. I tried to return to my normal life, but that was impossible. The nightmares continued, the fear a constant shadow. I saw figures in every dark corner, heard whispers on the wind, and jumped at every creak and unexpected noise. I never told anyone the full truth of what happened at the farm. I knew they wouldn't understand. They would just think I was crazy. I did more research, though. I learned more about Pastor Elijah Croft. He had been a controversial figure long before the witchcraft accusations, a fire and brimstone preacher who railed against sin and warned of the coming apocalypse. He had made enemies of many in the community, and his death was convenient for some. I also learned about the history of the farm itself, passed down through Megan's family for generations, from mother to daughter. It was a place, rumor had it, that was touched by darkness, where other strange events and tragedies had occurred. It was as if the farm was cursed, a place where the veil between worlds was thin, and I had stumbled right into the heart of it. Years have passed. The physical scars have faded, but the ones on my soul remain. I still jump at shadows. I still avoid old Bibles, and I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. I often wonder if that Bible is still there, pinned to the old truck in that collapsing barn. I wonder if Elijah Croft's spirit is truly sealed, or if he's just waiting patiently for the next person to break the rules.